All right, now this is going to start our first set of civil rights questions. Number one, the outstanding record of African Americans who served in the military forces during World War II was one reason that President Truman decided to do what? President Truman kind of made a bit of a groundbreaking decision here, and it was a major step forward for the civil rights movement. Okay, and what he did, and this is what just need to go ahead and memorize this. He put an end to racial segregation in the military. So that would be B. Number two, in 1957, President Eisenhower used federal troops in Little Rock, Arkansas to do what? All right. A. Eliminate racial discrimination in housing. No, he didn't use federal troops for that. B. Allow African Americans to vote in local elections. That might be something that they use federal troops for, but in this case, it's not what they did. Okay. C. Integrate public schools. Let's hold on to that. D. Admit African Americans to graduate programs. Okay. It's going to be C. All right. And remember, there were 9 African American students trying to attend um, public school in Little Rock, Arkansas, and they became known as the Little Rock Nine. President Eisenhower used federal troops to go in there and make sure that they were allowed to attend school. All right, number three. All right, we've got a chart up here. This is the estimates percentage of voting age African Americans registered to vote in 1960 and then in 1970. If you look across the board there, in most or in every case, there are huge increases in the percentage that are registered to vote between 1960 and 1970. Okay, so the table shows the change in estimated percentages of African Americans registered to vote as a result of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. What was most likely the long-term impact of the trend in this table? So, what would this trend eventually cause? So, let's see here. A. African Americans became the largest voting bloc in the South. In some areas they are, but no, that's not going to be it. But that it could lead to that eventually. B. The number of African Americans joining the Democratic Party decreased in the South. No, because it doesn't distinguish anything doing with party affiliation. C. The number of African Americans holding public office increased in the South. Let's hold on to that one, see if it makes sense. D. African Americans shifted their interest away from national politics to state politics in the South. No, they were still, just interested in politics in general. So whether it be state, local, or federal. Now, C. If we look at this one, it stands to reason that if we have more African Americans voting, especially during this time period, that they would tend to vote for other African Americans, which would definitely lead to an increase in the number of African Americans that are holding office in the South. All right, number four. Which of these statements describes both the 15th Amendment and the Voting Rights Act of 1965? All right, so these had to do with, um, you know, giving African Americans full rights with the 15th Amendment, and also with the Voting Rights Act, making sure that you know they're not denying anybody the right to vote based on race. Okay, so again, if you look at A, suffrage cannot be denied based on the basis of race. Okay, A, and it's going to be the answer because remember, suffrage means the right to vote, and the 15th. Just you could remove the 15th Amendment from this, and just the Voting Rights Act alone would refer to A. All right, number five. Why did large numbers of African Americans migrate to the North in the early 20th century? So why did African Americans specifically leave the South and go to the North? All right, well, let's go ahead and remember this. Why do we migrate in this country? People move to where jobs are. All right, so A, northern states offered them free farmland. That's not the case. There weren't a lot of farms up north, so it's not going to be A. B, labor unions in the north recruited them as members. No, it was actually hard for them to become union members. Excuse me. C, Southern Jim Crow laws restricted their job opportunities. That's a possibility. Let's hold on to it. B, new laws forced them to leave the South or pay heavy fines. No, there was no laws that required them to leave the South, so it's not going to be that. If we look at this, it was harder for them. Well, Jim Crow laws definitely restricted their ability to get better paying jobs. So it is going to be C. Again, they migrated due to jobs. All right, number 6. In March 1964, President Lyndon Johnson went before Congress and announced his support for the Equal Opportunity Act. It will give almost 500,000 underprivileged young Americans the opportunity to develop skills, continue education, and find useful work. First, we will give high priority to helping young Americans who lack skills, who have not completed their education, or who cannot complete it because they are too poor. What was the purpose of President Johnson's proposed legislation? Let's go ahead and sit back and think. What did President Johnson want to do as a president? Remember, President Johnson had his Great Society program. Okay, and the whole point of the Great Society was to end poverty. That was his goal. Really a war on poverty. So, more than likely, and if you read this little passage here, it goes right along with that. Okay, so it's not A, to expand civil service sector. It's not B, to overhaul the public school system, even though it is talking about possibly an overhaul in our education purposes. C, to provide the means to escape poverty. That's what it is. It is C. Number 7. The list describes several events during the Civil Rights Movement. 1957, federal troops enforced integration at an Arkansas high school. 1964, Civil Rights Act forbids discrimination in public facilities. 1965, Voting Rights Act forbids literacy tests for voters. Okay, what do these events indicate about the government response to the Civil Rights Movement? All right, so in other words, in all these cases, what did the federal government actually do? Is it A, the federal government continued to encourage social activism? No. B, the state governments actively upheld constitutional protections? No. Matter of fact, state governments were usually trampling on these constitutional protections. C, the state governments continued to promote political participation? No. They were fighting tooth and nail against political participation for some of their residents. D, the federal government actively secured constitutional guarantees. And that's the case. The federal government's the ones that came in and enforced these, basically enforced the law. It's going to be D. Why did Why did Stokely Carmichael's rhetoric differ from that of other civil rights advocates? In other words, why was he different? A, he was dissatisfied with the focus on social activism. No, he was a social activist. B, he was disappointed with the qualifications of minority leaders. No, that wasn't it either. C, he was dissatisfied with the emphasis on civil disobedience in the face of violence as a means to achieve social equality. Let's hold on to that one. D, he was disappointed with the involvement in economic boycotts of public services as a means to achieve economic equality. D might be partially correct because Carmichael's biggest thing was he wanted action. Just civil disobedience and protest wasn't good enough for him. He wanted, if they were facing violence, he was ready to fight. And that makes him, that goes like directly in the face of leaders like Martin Luther King, who were completely, non-violent advocates. Okay, so it's going to be C. Number 9. In the 1960s, women campaigned for an end to discrimination based on gender. In the 1960s, there were many examples of gender-based discrimination. Classified ads for employment were separated by gender in newspapers. Most women were unable to borrow money at a bank without a male cosigner. 75% of women who worked were saleswomen, clerks, factory laborers, or housekeepers. Based on this information, which area describes a common goal for progress in the Civil Rights Movement and the African American Civil Rights Movement? All right. If you look at this, what is it talking about? It's talking about job opportunities, and specifically, it's talking about economic opportunities. Okay, so it's going to be D. Number 10. The list identifies several issues associated with the Civil Rights Movement. Jim Crow laws, literacy tests, Plessy versus Ferguson. All right, why were these issues important motivations for civil rights reformers? Okay, if we look at this, first of all, the literacy tests kind of go back to Jim Crow. Jim Crow laws were forcing segregation. Okay, they were laws that were forcing civil, that violated individual rights. The literacy test, again, a law that violated personal rights. And Plessy versus Ferguson was a court case that upheld some of these laws, basically stating that separate but equal was okay. So discrimination was okay; it wasn't unconstitutional. All right, it's going to be A. There were all evidence of individual rights that were not upheld. All right, number 11. This is a description of changes during the civil rights movement. In 1960, only 5% of Mississippi's African American population was registered to vote. By 1968, 60% of the African American population was registered to vote. Other southern states showed similar change. Between 1965 and 1990, the number of African American state legislators and members of Congress increased from 2 to 160. Which factor increased African American political influence between 1960 and 1990? Is it going to be A, laws that forbid discriminatory hiring practices? No. Okay, we're not talking about getting a job. We're talking about, political power. So it's not going to be A. B, policies that ended discrimination in the workplace. Again, we're not talking about the workplace. We're talking about political power. So it's not going to be that. C, court cases that ended segregation in public schools. This has nothing to do with segregation in education. Okay. Or D, legislation that removed unfair electoral requirements. In other words, laws that went in and made it where everybody could vote. Okay, that's going to be it. That's where your vote is your political power. All right, number 12. Which statement evaluates the impact of the Selma to Montgomery marches on the expansion of voting rights? All right, so A, the marches aided the movement by promoting reform at the state level. They weren't getting any help at the state level, so the marches really didn't do anything at the state level, so to speak. B, the marches hindered the movement by provoking backlash at the local level. No, again, they were getting no help at the local level, so the marches weren't intended to generate any kind of assistance from the local government. So that's not the case. C, the marches aided the movement by rallying support among national politicians. That's what it's going to be. The marches gained national attention. Specifically, okay, we're talking about Selma to Montgomery, so we're talking about a march that took place in Alabama. There was no governing body in Alabama that was going to side with the protesters, with the civil rights leaders. Okay, it took things like this that gained national attention to shine the spotlight on it, so that politicians at the federal level would take notice and actually get something done about it. Number 13, in 1963, Governor George Wallace made this statement while opposing integration at the University of Alabama. I claim today for all people of the state of Alabama those rights reserved for them under the Constitution of the United States. Among those powers so reserved and claimed is the right of state authority in the operation of colleges and universities. Okay, what was Governor Wallace's justification for attempting to block racial integration at the University of Alabama? If you look back at this, if you look back at what he said, and it goes back to the Constitution, he is right in the idea that our state universities are under the authority of the individual states. The Constitution does not give the federal government any rights to step in and interfere with the workings of a school. Okay, that's a right that is reserved for the state. However, and I'll say, and that's what it is. I mean, he said the federal government had illegally taken a power reserved to the states, so that's going to be B. But that being said, anytime there's a state law that contradicts a federal law supersedes it. In other words, in this case, the state was trying to violate the individual rights of certain students by using racial discrimination, and the federal government stepped in to correct this. Number 14. The Supreme Court decisions were instrumental in Supreme Court decisions were instrumental in achieving goals of the civil rights movement. All right, 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson upheld a law allowing separate but equal public facilities. 1917, Buchanan versus Worley overturned a law requiring segregated residential areas. So you have one that says segregation is okay, another one that says segregation is illegal. According to the information above, which issues were in conflict in the Supreme Court decisions? Okay, and it's going to be D, legalized discrimination, which that would be with Plessy versus Ferguson, and the 14th Amendment, which has the equal protection under the law clause. And number 15, in 1972, Congress created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. The commission is empowered to prevent any person from engaging in any unlawful employment practice. Okay, which practice would be considered unlawful employment practice under the Equal Employment Opportunity Act of 1972? Okay, would it be, let's just process of elimination, evaluation of employees based on a skill level? That's never illegal. Let's remove A. B, using race or gender to disqualify job applicants. That sounds like it might be right. Let's hold on to that one. C, paying different salaries for different types of work. No, that's not illegal. So let's remove that one. D, limiting interviews to applicants with college degrees. That's not illegal. Some jobs require a college degree. So just by process of elimination, the answer is B. But if you sit there and look at it, you cannot say you can't apply for this job because you are black, or because you're white, or because you're a woman, or because you're a man. That is illegal.